everyone, Jess from WindsorEats back again today to show you a bit of the bread making process. Today we're going to be using the yeast that we made last week to make our very first loaf of sourdough. We're going to be breaking this down into two phases, and today we'll be covering the first 4 steps. That's creating the leaven with the yeast, auto-lysing the flour, which is really just hydrating the flour with the water, incorporating the rest of the ingredients, and last but not least, the bulk fermentation process. I have a very simple 4-ingredient recipe for you using all-purpose flour, water, your yeast, and salt. That's it. You can use different variations of flour. I like to use a 10% whole wheat ratio in my bread. I find it gives it a nice flavor, but you can do whatever you use whatever you have at home. So this is nice and simple for the recipe. The recipe I'll be sharing today is also to make a single loaf of bread. You can find lots of recipes online to make 2 loaves of bread. That involves cutting the loaf after the bulk fermentation process. We're going to be doing a single loaf process, so we'll be skipping that step. But you can you sort of just follow along with me today. Very first step is to create the leaven for the bread. So that's taking your yeast, and we're just going to feed it with fresh flour and water to create young yeast to use in our bread. I like to use equal parts flour, water, and yeast. At the very least, use as much flour and water in weight as you use yeast. You can always use a little bit more flour and water to help give your starter a healthy boost. So I went ahead earlier today and I made my leaven in this container. When I was done feeding it with the flour and water, I had about this much, and it rose to about here before I used it in my dough. That's it for the leaven. It's going to take about 5 hours for that feeding till it gets to that peak point where you can see it's more than doubled in size. It's almost tripled. And then you're ready for the next step. And that's auto-lysing the flour and water. I like to incorporate my yeast when I auto-lyse. I just find it's nice and easy. So what I've done is I mix the water. So my recipe calls for 75% water. So that's 75% of the amount of flour that I'm using. I'm using a 600-gram flour recipe. So that, when you do the math, is 450 grams of water. I'm going to hold just a little bit back for when I mix in my salt. So when I put 400 grams into my bowl of water. And then I mixed my leaven, 150 grams of leaven, which is 25% of the flour weight, in with the water. And that broke the starter down. And then last, I mixed in my flour. I mixed that very lightly. You do not want to overwork it at this point. You're just making sure that the flour and water kind of get covered together, and you're going to let it rest. A typical auto-lyse is 30 minutes to an hour, and the dough will completely change from that point. At first, it will be sort of a shaggy, dry mess, and after that relaxation period of 30 minutes to an hour, you'll notice that it is much softer. So this is after about a 45-minute auto-lyse, and so all I've got in this bowl here is just flour, water, yeast, and I've given it some time. Last, I'll be adding in my salt, and if you remember, I said I left back about 50 grams of water with my salt. Typical sourdough salt ratio is going to be 2% or less. I add the salt in last because it does change the consistency of the dough, and it does affect the gluten. It doesn't affect it greatly, but if you add it in last, you will get a stronger loaf of bread. So I just am sort of going to mix my water and salt together. Pour that into my bowl. And when you're mixing your dough, always use a wet hand. So I keep a bowl of water nearby. I'm just sort of going to dimple it very simply and just sort of fold in from the bottom. Just working that salt in there, pulling the edges of the dough, so you can see. As you work in that last bit of water there, You'll notice that your dough has sort of become nice and soft. We're now going to, so you've got lots of potential for gluten here. We're now going to be weaving this gluten into a net in a process called stretch and fold. Now, stretch and fold is essentially just taking the edge of the dough and folding it over. But your dough is going to need to rest at least 20 minutes in between each stretch and fold set. Now, how many stretch and folds you do really depends on how your dough is looking. So you're going to need to practice a few times to really get the hang of what you're looking for. But really, besides that, there is no other kneading process needed. You don't need a mixer. You can see I've got a stand mixer in the corner there. I won't be using it during my bread making process. All I'm going to do here is just give this about 20 minutes to relax and get all of those ingredients incorporated, and then I'll start my stretch and folds. And I'll demonstrate that process for you when we come back in 20 minutes. So we are 20 minutes into the bulk fermentation process now, and we are ready for our first set of stretch and folds. Now, the bulk fermentation process is going to depend on how much yeast you put in. So in this recipe, we've used 25%. Again, baker's percentages, that's 25% of the total weight of our flour. And we are going to, so that is going to be about a 4-hour bulk fermentation. Now, if we were to use less yeast, you would definitely want to give it a longer bulk fermentation. And in that time, it's going to double in size. But we're going to start that process off with 2 series of stretch and folds. So again, demoing that process, you're going to pull from one side, just gently stretching your dough. You don't want to pull it so hard that it's going to break, and folding it over. So I'm going to go from the top and then pull up from the bottom. Then I'll do the left side and fold it over and grab the right side. So you're folding and then grabbing all of the new edges and then folding that in. So as you start to play with your dough, you'll notice that it doesn't have as much of a stretch. It starts to tense up. And that's why we need to let it rest, again, for another 20 minutes. Now, you can also let it rest for a little bit longer. Let's say you're in the middle of doing something and you forget about it. Not a big deal. It can rest for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and you can come back to it. Resting for longer is not necessarily going to hurt it, but just remember that your total bulk fermentation process is going to be about 4 hours. Again, even that time is flexible. You're really just looking for your dough size to double, and then it's ready to go. So I'm going to give this another rest, another stretch and fold, and let that sit through the bulk fermentation. So hang in there with me. And that's the second stretch and fold process. So now I'm going to let it rest for about an hour and a half, approximately. And I'm going to keep an eye on it. Once it's doubled in size, it's going to be ready to move to phase 2. So for phase 2, a few things that I recommend are a bench scraper. I like to use a bowl scraper as well, plastic, just to help get the dough out of the bowl nice and easy. I also recommend a proofing basket or any kind of basket with a cloth liner will do. I didn't have these for years, and I was able to just use either a plastic basket with holes in the bottom. I've used a cereal bowl before. If you have it covered with a liner and then that liner is covered like a simple cloth and that cloth is covered with flour, you should be okay. A few other things that you could also use is a brush to get some excess flour off of your bread, and also something to cut your dough with. And so you can just use a sharp knife if you don't have a lamp to cut it with. So that will be the next phase for you guys after our 2-hour bulk fermentation. So stay tuned for phase 2.